Okay, today we're going to be looking at indicator 7.3, which is World War II and the Big Three. We're going to look at some of the events of World War II. We're going to start off, this is going to be broken up into two parts. So this will be the first part. And so we will get a second part to this probably in the next few days. So be aware that that is coming. So before we begin, let's look at some of the learning objectives, some things that you should be able to answer by the time we finish going over this material. Number one, why did the U.S. and the Soviet Union have so much distrust of each other? You need to know that. Who were the big three? And of course, we're going to point those out in just a few minutes. Explain the beginning of the war in the European theater. So, what happens right at the start. Explain the importance of the African campaign, explain the Italian campaign, and explain the significance of the invasion of Normandy, which is also known as D-Day. And then the final thing, how does the war in Europe come to an end? So these 7 questions should be 7 questions that you should be able to answer. When we get done going over this lecture, I'd love for you to write these questions down and then answer them at the end of your notes so you'll know and be able to explain these things. That will be great, and I'll be looking for those things. So with that, let's get going. Let's look at the first thing, which is the United States and the Soviet Union's distrust of each other. And of course, there are a lot of underlying things that we need to look at when we're talking about why these two countries distrusted each other. First off, let's talk about the United States. The United States, their economy revolves around capitalism, and our government is mainly a democracy where the people pick and choose their leaders. We, of course, had opposed the Russian Revolution in 1917. We wanted Russia to become a more like us, a republic or a democracy. And of course, they didn't go that route. They turned to communism. Many in the United States hated communism. Remember, the Red Scare had happened in the 1920s. There was a fear that the communists were trying to take over. So a lot of that resentment was still there. And we were aiding the other Allied powers more than aiding the Soviet Union during this period because we felt like the Soviet Union and Germany had formed this alliance with this non-aggression pact that they had agreed on before the war started. Remember, Stalin and Hitler had agreed not to attack each other, and they divided Poland up once the war begins. On the Soviet Union side, of course, the Soviets are communist. Communism, again, the government controls pretty much everything, mainly the means of production, prices, and so on, if you look at it from the economic standpoint. And of course, the Soviet Union was a dictatorship led by Joseph Stalin. Again, they had that secret alliance with Germany, the non aggression pact. Make sure that you know that, write that down. But the non aggression pact was an agreement between the Soviet Union and Germany where they agreed not to fight each other. And of course, once the war started, they divided Poland up. And the Soviet Union was not on our side at the beginning of the war, so they didn't join the Allies. So, for these reasons, a lot of distrust had been established between the Soviet Union and the United States. Next, let's look at the big three. The big three included, and we've got them pictured here, Joseph Stalin for the Soviet Union, also the USSR would be the other term that we would use. Franklin Roosevelt, which FDR for the United States, and then, of course, Winston Churchill for Great Britain. And all 3 men are pictured there on this picture. When the U.S. finally joined the war, these leaders became known as the Big Three. And again, they had met on a few occasions during the war. Remember, initially, the Soviet Union is not part of the Allied powers. It doesn't happen until after Germany invades the Soviet Union that the Soviet Union comes over to the Allied powers. And again, this is when we get the formation of these big three. Let's move on to the next, which is all about the beginnings of the war in the European theater. Remember that Germany has invaded Poland. They're quickly marching through most of Europe. And by the spring of 1940, they are going to take France. And here's a picture of Hitler in front of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, showing that they have taken France. By the summer of 1940, Great Britain is the only country left to defend against the Nazis, and Hitler is going to launch something known as the Battle of Britain. The main thing you need to know about the Battle of Britain was it was an air war, pretty much, over the skies of Great Britain. Here's a picture you can see there in the center of the pilots with the bomb, that said this is slated for Hitler. But again, this Battle of Britain is going to be all-out war over the skies of Great Britain. Germany's going to start bombarding Great Britain night and day. They use their famous Air Force. The name of the Air Force is called the Luftwaffe. If you don't know how to spell it, it's Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe would begin these raids over Great Britain. The United States would send aid to Great Britain with bombers, and eventually the aid and the British pilots and British Air Force, which is known as the Royal Air Force, are going to be able to defend, and Hitler's going to give up on this idea of being able to take Great Britain. In the summer of 1941, Hitler, what many regard to be his biggest mistake, decides that he is going to turn on Joseph Stalin. And again, I just mentioned this earlier. He invades the Soviet Union. This invasion of the Soviet Union is known as Operation Barbarossa. He would quickly march through the Soviet Union. The Germans, though, are going to stretch themselves too far. They're going to start to freeze when the winter starts to set in. Their tanks are going to not be able to move. They're going to get stuck in mud. The Soviet Union is going to fight back. They've used a policy which has been done before, known as scorched earth, where they tried to burn and destroy anything that the German army might try to use for food and for supplies. So they tried to destroy that, allowed the German army in, only to get them trapped in the Russian winter. Again, once Germany does this, this causes the Soviet Union to become an allied power. Let's look at the next thing on our list, and that is going to be the African campaign, also known as Operation Torch. Operation Torch began in 1942. The purpose of this campaign by the United States and Great Britain was to free the Mediterranean Sea from German control. It was also to protect the oil fields. Most of you that are familiar with Northern Africa, which you can see down here, all of this is Northern Africa, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco. All of these places are known for oil deposits. And of course, Germany needed those oil deposits to keep their war machine going. So we were trying to protect these oil fields from the Germans and drive the Germans out of this area, especially the oil fields too in the Middle East, where like places like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, which would also have been vulnerable. So the United States is going to try, and Great Britain will try to protect against the Germans taking over this area, and eventually they are going to be successful. This is going to take some of the pressure off of the Soviet Union because Germany is going to have to turn its attention to protecting those oil fields in North Africa. So again, it did offer a little bit of relief for the Soviet Union, but still not a direct attack on Germany, especially in Europe. Let's move on to the next one, which is the Italian campaign. U.S. and Great Britain's forces would land in Italy. They started off in Sicily, and then they would march up the boot of Italy. Still, once again, not a direct attack on Germany, which is what the Soviet Union desperately wants. Soviets become not happy because of the way that the Allies are going about, fighting Germany at this point. They want the United States and Great Britain to open up a second front. And so far, they haven't done that by attacking North Africa and Italy. But the United States and Great Britain are going to be successful in Italy. It's going to lead to the downfall of the dictator of Italy, which is Benito Mussolini, who's pictured here. And Mussolini would be hung, and there's a picture of Mussolini and his wife hanging up there. And of course, it wasn't a good thing for Mussolini to be shot, hung, and then, of course, the crowds gathered around. They began to kick and beat up on Mussolini's dead corpse, which wasn't a pretty scene. German forces, though, are going to retreat out of Italy, but mainly to the northern portion of Italy, where they will continue to fight. Finally, the United States, Great Britain, and France are going to join together in what would become known as D-Day, or the invasion of Normandy. D-Day occurs on June 6, 1944. This is when the Allies are going to invade Europe, and you need to make sure you highlight that or underline it. Make sure you understand that part. This was an Allied amphibious invasion of France. And amphibious means that we're going to do it by sea and by land. We're going to go all kinds of different ways to try to take this land back from the Germans who had taken over France. Normandy, of course, is in France. If you look at this map here in the center, you can see the beaches. Omaha, probably the one that's the most well known, but you can see where these troops are going to attack on Normandy Beach, again, which is in France. Please make sure you know that Normandy is in France. Once we do this, this is going to force the Germans to have to fight a two-front war. They're going to have to fight on the Eastern Front, which is where they're fighting the Soviets, and they're going to have to fight on the Western Front, where they'll be facing the United States, France, and Great Britain. So this is going to put Germany in a bind. This is the beginning of the end. The Germans are going to be forced back. And the significance of all of this is that France is going to be freed from German control. So this is the beginning of the end with the invasion of Normandy. And the Germans are on the downslide once this takes place. Okay, let's look at the final thing, which is going to be the end of Europe, or the end in Europe. The European theater is going to come to a swift end after D-Day. We get a famous battle called the Battle of the Bulge. The reason why it's called that, if you look at this map, you can see this was once a straight line all the way across. The Germans are going to launch everything they have and drive the Americans and the British and the French back along that line, and this is what creates this pocket known as the Bulge. This was the last German offensive, the last chance for the Germans to try to win, and of course it's going to fail. Once the Battle of the Bulge comes to an end, the United States and Great Britain and France are going to start pushing into Germany. Hitler's going to retreat into his bunker, where he would later commit suicide by the end of April. During this time, February of 1945, we're going to have the Yalta Conference. This is where the big three are going to meet once again. They would plan the ending of the war and what they wanted to see happen, and they would also help create the United Nations at this meeting in Yalta. So make sure that you know that. They planned the end of the war, and they created the formation of the United Nations during that conference. VE Day, or Victory over Europe Day, would occur on May 8, 1945. Germany has been defeated. This is victory in Europe. But the World War II is still going on with the Japanese in the Pacific. So World War II is not over. It's over in Europe. The end of the European theater has come to an end, and the Allies are successful in winning in Europe. So the war is still dragging on in the Pacific, and we're going to get to that in the next few slides. Okay, so this is the end of part 1. Make sure that you have all of your notes. Go back, and I want you to answer those learning objective questions that we saw at the beginning of the presentation. Make sure that you answer all 7 of those. Write those on your note sheet, or write it on a piece of paper separate if you need to. and make sure that you've answered those questions. We will pick up with the next presentation about the Pacific Theater and the ending of World War II. Okay? Catch you guys again on the next one.